Hi, welcome everyone. We have Dr. Sasmit Patra with us, who is going to be the keynote, give the keynote speech today. We are so delighted to have you, Dr. Patra. You're going to speak. Dr. Patra is going to speak about governance today, but to speak a little bit more about, to invite him officially into the folds of this session, I invite the Dean of JSPF. Dr. Ashish Bharadwaj to kindly introduce Dr. Patra.
Thank you very much, Sohini. I'm going to make it quick. Welcome everyone to the 5th session of the Global Finance Conclave. We are back with another keynote address, a very special one, which has been strategically placed here to contextualize the subsequent sessions, which are going to be on fintech and financial inclusion, issues of data governance, which my colleague Sohini is going to be chairing. It's a pleasure to have Dr. Sasmit Patra deliver this keynote address on governance. I'll quickly introduce him. Dr. Patra is a member of Parliament, Rajya Sabha from Odisha, representing Biju Janata Dal. He has a very multidisciplinary academic profile, which is quite hard to find in politicians in India. He has a PhD in business management, he has an MBA in human resources and a law degree. He is a member of Parliamentary Standing Committee on Personnel, Pensions, Grievances, Law and Justice, and a member of the Consultative Committee on External Affairs. A very unconventional political leader with almost 2 decades of experience of teaching, of being a dean of country's first Indo-French business school, I'm told, being a national spokesperson for his party, and having a very rich understanding of the corporate sector. It's a pleasure for us to have him. With this, let me invite Dr. Patra to deliver his keynote address. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Bharadwaj. Thank you, Sohini ji and Amlan ji. It's really a wonderful opportunity. And firstly, I'd like to thank the Jindal School of Banking and Finance, OP Jindal Global University, for inviting me this afternoon to deliver this keynote address titled Governance. And it's wonderful to note that the Jindal School of Banking and Finance is undertaking the 3rd Global Finance Conclave. And the title is very interesting. It is India Growth Story from 1991 to 2001 and beyond. I think that sets the table for about 30 years of reforms, or rather we should say transition and evolution. And specifically, again, thank the university that for giving me and inviting me this keynote address on governance. I think the term governance itself is, it's so wide, it's so rich, and it's so challenging, primarily because everything and anything comes within governance. But what I'll try to do over the next 25 to 30 minutes would be to try and understand and share with you my understanding of where do I see governance. And we will probably start the journey from 1991, try to get an understanding about the background of governance and what led to 1991 per se, because we are all aware what happened in 1991, but thereafter, going forward into the present scenario, because of a lack of time, I will not take you through the entire chronology, but we will try to look at the broad basis or the broad pieces that are there, which should really help us to really understand and contextualize that why this India growth story that we're talking about of the last 30 years and going forward in terms of governance with specific reference to governance, and of course the coming sessions on fintech and financial inclusion, how does this really transpire for a country like India? So without much ado, let me start with trying to understand 1991 through the prism of governance. Now, being a parliamentarian and also having been a professor, I'll try to dwell on both sides of the profession so that I can do justice to this keynote address. So there will be a bit of the governance part, which would be developmental, which will be about inclusion, which will be about social impact, but from the prism of politics. Because today governance, or even in 1991 when we see, governance cannot be seen in isolation as a vertical in silo as compared to probably politics. Politics is very much a part and parcel of governance and the policies that emanate from this governance. So let me start firstly with 1991 and try to share with you my perspective of how the governance was. Now, let's go back to 1991 very quickly. 30 years back, what was the scenario of the country? We were in extremely bad shape. I don't want to again relate about macroeconomics and microeconomics, but it was a shaky start. You were looking at a government of the then Honorable Prime Minister Shri P.V. Narasimha Rao. It was a minority government. The government did not have the numbers to get to that magical figure of 272. So here you're starting with the idea of reforms in 1991 with a political mandate which is not enough. And that's a very interesting area. Usually people say, like in the present government, you have 300 plus seats, and you say, oh, the government is stable and they can go about reforms. But rewind to 1991 and try to understand the complexities, the existing constraints, and the shaky possibilities that existed, primarily because governance could have been affected adversely because the P.V. Narasimha Rao government was a minority government, did not have the numbers, and every time there was a no confidence motion, it was shaky. So you're starting on governance and economic reforms in 1991 with a shaky government in parliament and a lack of political consensus behind that party. On top of that, in 1991, rewind back 30 years, if you felt bureaucracy is bad now, think 30 years back and the red tapeism that used to be there in the Indian bureaucracy and the slumber that it was in. So the reforms of 1991 cannot be seen in isolation to the shaky government that was there because of a lack of numbers in the parliament, but also because of the red tape bureaucracy that existed, which said nothing can be done. Forget about reforms. On top of that, in 1991, governance was driven by a political will through a technocrat finance minister. Till then, if you see, it was Mr. Madhu Dandavati or even earlier, you find mostly were people who had political background. But here you have Dr. Manmohan Singh, who's a technocrat, who's an economist, who's a person seen like a bureaucrat. Today, bureaucrats are the flavor of the seasons in the union cabinet. But then bureaucrats were considered and looked down upon by the political hierarchy. So 1991 reforms and the governance that came with that came on the background of a technocrat finance minister who did not have the financial backing or probably the pedigree of having been a blue-blooded politician that was required for being a finance minister. On top of that, governance was looking to try and change from 1991 onwards onto a technological shift, which is termed as automation in those days. So my first piece that I want to share with you this afternoon primarily stems from the political will and ideology and the vision and the resultant impact that 1991 truly gave. It wasn't that governance was driven for 1991 reforms from a position of strength or a position of convenience or a position of comfort. It was from a shaky government who did not have numbers in the parliament, did not have the political mandate to pass every bill. It had to push through. It had a technocrat finance minister. It did not have a blue-blooded, political greyhound, so to say. And on top of that, a red tape bureaucracy that wasn't used to the idea of the LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Those were the buzzwords. And I remember LPG was liquefied petroleum gas, in the words of some bureaucrats then, that, oh, LPG is not liberalization, privatization, globalization, it's all gas. So you must remember one thing, when you talk about governance today, in the light of 1991 reforms, it has to be seen in the context of the political will and the sheer political ideology that we must push through reforms. And that's where the visionary thought process of not only Dr. Manmohan Singh, because he's always credited as the Manmohanomics, but if you did not have the strength and the political will of a man like Mr. P.V. Narasimha Rao, who was running a minority government, this would not have been possible. So we have to look at governance from that perspective. I'd like to come directly into 2014. A lot of water has flown by then. And in 2014, something interesting that I'd like to share about is the book that was written by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam, the former president of ours and a very dear, loved president, who talked about governance for growth in India. And that book became a very talking point because that book came at a time when there was a major transition happening in the country. There were two governments, successive governments of the Congress, the UPA 1 and the UPA 2, which was again had its own problems in the UPA 2. And the people were generally disenchanted with the governance of this country. They said, where is the governance? And that is where you find this book by Dr. Abdul Kalam, and I would encourage all of you to go through, which focused on some of the key areas, such as reigniting the faith of the voter. When we talk about governance, we talk about financial inclusion. Is governance considered a bedrock which has trust, which has credibility, which has the value systems? That is important. That's in the book. He goes on to say, Dr. Kalam, he talked about creative leadership, the essence of good governance. He talked about inclusive growth for good governance. He talked about e-governance for transparent societies. He talked about right to information in governance. He talked about public audit and good governance. He talked about transparency and governance for every citizen and the vision of a new India. Why am I giving you these pieces very, very quickly? It is because I want you and me to understand that what was the context of governance in 2014. We all know the kind of problems that the UPA2 had faced between 2009 to 2014. There was a disenchantment, and that was the time when Dr. Kalam came out with this book and wanted to refocus the idea of governance in the minds of the people of this nation, saying, hey, don't be so disenchanted. Let's keep faith. Let's go back to the governance mechanisms. And he gave us certain specific tools and techniques through this book, where the idea of governance was again reignited for transparency, creative leadership, inclusive growth, transparent societies, e-governance. Such of these areas which are building blocks for a good governance were actually reignited by Dr. Kalam. So I think when we look back at 1991, we focus and find out the background and the strong political will. And in 2014, again, we see the kind of impact that these thought process of Dr. Kalam does in terms of refocusing our ideas on governance. And what are those? As I said, the right to information for governance, the governance for every citizen, inclusive growth, creative leadership, essence of good governance, role of youth in governance, and e-governance for transparent societies. So how has governance in India actually evolved? It's very interesting over the last 30 years, if you see, governments, even post-independence, have always looked at driving more effective governance, more accountable governance, more transparent governance, and more decentralized governance. Now, there will be many pundits and many juries will be out who may say, okay, we may have become effective, but are we truly accountable, truly transparent, and truly decentralized? But I believe that over the last 70 years, and more so to the point of the last 30 years, if you see any government, whether it's in the state, whether it's in the center, you'll find that there has been a consistent pressure to actually go for more effective, accountable, transparent, and decentralized governance. And why is that? Why this necessity for evolution of governance in India? First, evolving aspirations. Today, the youth who is there, who comprises 60% of the population, is not happy with the roti, kapda, and makan. It is not happy with Garibi Hatao. Those were the slogans which used to be there in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, or even up to the 90s and to the 21st century. Today, the population, today, the country is more aspirational. It just does not want basic food, clothing, and shelter. It wants dignity for labor. It wants equal rights. It wants to grow. It wants to have disposable income. It wants to rise up the socioeconomic ladder. So therefore, there is an evolving aspiration, which is again backed by, number two, an evolving demographics. We became a younger population. From a population which was solidly slow, we became a younger population, which more than 60% population below the ages, around the ages of 28 now. Of course, 18 used to be the catchword. Now it's kind of come up by about 10 years. So 25, 26 years is about 60% of the population. So a younger population, young aspirations, there's more demand on governance to deliver. That you give me a 1 rupee rice, I'll not be only happy. You put a house for me, I'm not only happy. I want employment. I want Rozgar. I want to have my own 2-bit. I want to have my 2 cents and also have a voice. That led to, again, evolving socioeconomic processes, which led to evolving voters' preferences. In our country, usually, the politicians or the people who run governance of the country usually feel, okay, caste and religion are important determinants of winning elections. But what they realize gradually is, while you do have those considerations, even today when it comes to elections, people are also watching you on the development agenda on the governance agenda. If there is a rising prices, you will see the effect. If there is a farmer's agitation, you will see the effect. I'm sorry. If you have specific problems that are facing India today, you will face the problems. Nothing will go unheard. And that is why you find today the governance in India has evolved, and that has really pushed the people who are governing the country today to also change. Going back to the next aspect, I would like to focus on how has governance per se, improved the governance mechanisms which are crucial for citizens and businesses. Now, governance mechanisms have also evolved over the last 30 years from 1991 to 2021, and they will keep on evolving as we go forward. Now, since 1991, what has happened? Once the economic reforms have happened, and subsequently they have been taken forward by successive governments, you found that the specific areas of policy making has also become very defined, which starts with legislation of laws, framing of rules, enacting of guidelines, delineation of processes, implementation on grounds, the bottlenecks thereof, and finally the monitoring and feedback. Earlier, whenever you used to have specific laws, sometimes people would not even bother whether there were rules that had been framed. There were many laws that were passed by the parliament, but they never saw the light of the day. Why? Because the framing of the rules of those laws were never done, and people just forgot about it. But as governance improved, as the pressure from the constituents improved, people started feeling, the governance started feeling, if we're making legislations, we have to enact the laws for it. Once we enact the laws, we have to define the guidelines and procedures. We have to ground it, implement it. And if there are bottlenecks, we have to solve them. And earlier, there was this feeling that you can get away with anything. But as time has passed, people have started putting the governance on the radar, on the question, on the dock. And I think that is being something which has changed drastically. So if you were to look at it, let's try to understand how governance has shifted or evolved from governance with respect to public services in India. Let's talk about cash transfers to direct bank transfers. It was unthought of that one fine day for Manrega, a program like Manrega, where the remittances were given in cash. And that is where a lot of the pilferages used to happen. Today, even for Manrega, even for the paddy procurement, the food distribution programs, the ration cards, the Ujjwala programs, or the various government programs that are there, we have shifted and migrated from a cash dependency to a direct bank transfer. That truly is. Now, there can always be takers who will say, okay, but is it really working? Whether there is corruption. But the fact is, to a certain extent, and I want to quote the famous line from the late Prime Minister Shri Rajiv Gandhi, who said that if I send 100 rupees, 1 rupee, 80 paisa does not reach the people, it's only 20 paisa that reaches. This idea of governance to try and ensure that the 80 paisa also reaches the people, or at least the most of it, has been one of the key indicators of driving governance in our country over the last 30 years as we have matured. The One Nation, One Card, the biometrics of Aadhaar, there were a lot of people talking about, and I do agree with some of them about the privacy issues of the data of biometrics and the Aadhaar. But the fact is, by seeding the Aadhaar, you have, in an essence, created a platform where you can migrate and transfer benefits directly to the accounts and to the benefits of the people right down to the grassroots, the bottom of the pyramid. And that is where true transformation is taking place. The right to information. It was something that came as a legacy from the UK government, which talks about building transparency and accountability. Today, if you find a lot of the government people get edgy because of RTI, but somewhere it has made them accountable. That is true governance. That's been transformation. The Citizens Charter, putting people on the dock for being delayed, for the late, and then actually having to pay up for it. The digital transactions, I'll come to it in a bit. Then the ease of doing business and the ease of living index. Now, this is very interesting because the ease of doing business, now this is where I come to governance and business activity in India. If people in the 1990s wanted to get, we came from an Inspector Raj, a license Raj era of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. People who are not adept with that would do well to understand how we have transformed. If we were to really go back into the concepts of the Inspector Raj and the license Raj era, where governance was always at a toss and was at the feet of the bureaucrats and the government, and they used to determine how they would do it. So the facelessness of doing things, the reforms that were required of making those changes, it started with the idea of building the ease of doing business and mainstreaming it. Why was a necessity? Primarily because if you had to globalize, if you had to go back with the global players, if you had to be a global player in the international domain, then you could not afford to be in a silo and say that, okay, everything is hunky-dory. That's where the ease of doing business happened. Along with the ease of doing business, it came the ease of living index. Today you find about smart cities. This idea of governance of smart cities came why? It was to make cities better to live in. And that is where it was not only to keep it limited to about 4 metros or 6 metros or 10 metros, it was about increasing it to 100, 200, 300 cities so that the living standards and the living experience of people improve. And by that governance mechanism, you will be able to improve people not wanting to move away, but continuing to stay there and developing the economic fabric of that place where they were. Let's look at another area, the focus on foreign direct investment. Now, this is a major change from that was in the 1991 pre-era. Before 1991, there was this Videshi versus Swadeshi movement. But since 1991 and even today, the present government, which used to swear by earlier when they were not in the government with Swadeshi, has actually removed capping in various sectors relating to defense and others for foreign direct investment. Why? Because you realize you cannot do stuff all by your own. Governance has realized and woken up that government cannot do it. Disinvestment, that's another area. And this started with Vajpayeeji's era, and it has come up again now, that the government has realized, look, we cannot run business and you cannot run welfare. Let the people who run businesses, let the government focus on welfare, the Atmanirbhar Bharat, the indigenization concept, the Make in India, the Skilled in India, and the JAM, the Jan Dhan, the Aadhaar, and the Mudra. Well, that's what the government has been talking about. Of course, again, there are a lot of criticism saying whether it has been completely done, what is the level of its efficiency. I will leave that on. But what I would like to say is whether it is the present government or tomorrow, let's say another government comes, the BJP government goes and the Congress government, let's say, comes. Would they be able to roll back the reforms that have happened? Can they roll back Aadhaar? No. Can they roll back Jan Dhan? No. Can you roll back the credit guarantees that have been provided? No. So what we are essentially as an economy going forward is in terms of financial inclusion. I will be skipping the part on ease of doing business because there is a very short time. I think I have another 7 minutes or so for my 30 minutes to be complete. I'll go directly into e-governance, which is a very important area of governance today and is considered as the future, which is a game changer. But the question is it a game changer or a mirage? Have we reached or are there miles to go before we reach? And it's about the asymmetries in opportunities. It is about the digital divide that exists between the haves and the have-nots. I was a part of the Standing Committee on Education, and of course that report has come out in public, where it was found that only 24% of the households surveyed had digital devices for their children to undertake the online learning programs. Can you imagine? During the entire COVID period of 2 years, only 24% families had access to digital devices in this country that they could use for their children to actually study online. What happens to the 75%? So this has actually exposed to us the grim realities that exist on the ground. We have the BharatNet, we have various other programs that we have. But the question is, who does it? Today, of course, the telecom and the digital sector is actually by the center. The center decides the telecom and the broadband connectivity, and the states just facilitate it. Again, there is a tutu meme that keeps on happening between centers and states in terms of the asymmetries, and the digital divide is definitely there. It's very interesting because there are districts in my state of Odisha, in Koraput, in Malkangiri, in Nabarangpur, in Mayurbhanj, and I have been there personally. And if you go there, you can't even get a mobile network, forget about a data network. And that is where you find that there's so much to be done if we truly want to broad base e-governance to the grassroots. And I'll quickly try to sum up in the next 5 minutes about and contextualize on governance and the adoption of fintech. Now we're talking about fintech in the next panel discussion. We're talking about the digital economy. We're talking about advancement of digital financial services. But I would say demonetization, rightly or wrongly, there are always people on both sides of the fences, but demonetization somewhere forced the country to move to a digital economy. We would not have done that by ourselves. There was a lot of losses, of course, because of demonetization. The way it was done, there's a lot of pain. That's a given. But the fact is, because of the demonetization and that period, if you look at the millions of transactions that increased, it was primarily moving forward from the demonetization part and moving forward and trying to make it financially inclusive. Now comes the bigger point, which probably will be discussed in the next panel discussion, would be the role of the law and regulatory practices on how to support this market and control the abuse of power. And that is where I believe governance has a big role to play, because the next big thing happening today is the adoption of fintech. Now, legislation for that matter, there has been a committee that has been set up by the parliament, which is focusing primarily on the data protection law. And they've had series of meetings and they have tried to complete their overall understanding about it. But the question is, how do we map future legal policies? How do we ensure governance strategies? How do we define and encourage innovation? And how do we protect people from unauthorized data breaches, monopolistic market takeovers, and ensure consumer welfare? I'll give you a very small example about how tech-driven financial inclusion can be looked at. And this probably will contextualize for the next level. Would be, what are the pitfalls and the potential of this financial inclusion? Maybe talk about financial inclusion. Whom do we consider as the financial inclusion? Is it the person who's sitting in Delhi, Mumbai, Sonipat, Bhubaneswar? Or is it a person who is sitting in Koraput, in Malkangiri, in Mayurbhanj, in Kalahandi? I think those are the areas that we have to focus in, that financial inclusion would be incomplete if we focus on the 20% and not focus on the 80%. It's remarkable today that less than 3% of this nation today has a reasonable broadband connectivity, where you can say, yes, it's a stable broadband. I have a Wi-Fi broadband at the moment. It's running at a 4G speed, so I'm accessing to you. But if I were to go on a drive about, say, 500 kilometers or 400 kilometers per year, you can't even see my face. It's so grainy. And that is where you have to find the potentials and the pitfalls of financial inclusion, and e-commerce, especially fintech, would not be possible if the bedrock of technology and the policies driving technology and data are not defined, which is basically about the legal and regulatory architecture for fintech, the effective mechanisms of governance, issues of data security, privacy of consumer data, data protection norms. What is personal data and what is non-personal data? What is the data that can be shared? What is the data that the companies can monetize? What is the market power of private enterprises? And how do we enable the tech companies and startups to innovate and create value while ensuring that the data privacy is met? Over the last almost 3 to 4 months, and I've got a couple of minutes, I'll just wrap up. Over the last 3 to 4 months, the data privacy issue has been grappling. And I know for sure because one of my senior colleagues in the parliament, who was also a keynote speaker today, Dr. Amar Patnaik, who's an honorable member of parliament from my party in Odisha, from Rajya Sabha, and a senior member, he was a former CAG as well. And he is part of that committee, which is there looking after the data protection and vetting the law of data protection. I think that is a very crucial area. Just to create one area of data protection itself has taken us so much that, can you imagine when it's actually implemented, the dynamics of what is considered as personal data and what is considered non-personal data? What is the differentiation between those? What is the nuances of that? I think those are areas, that's just one of the area, but a critical area, because that deals with the privacy of an individual. I believe, to sum it up today in this keynote address, we started from 1991 and we have come up today in 2021, where we find that reforms have taken place. And any reform that has been made has been not being made in isolation. There has been a continuum, and the reforms that have come about cannot be rolled back. You cannot go back on those reforms. So every successive government that will come will have to take it forward. What we have to be mindful of, are we realizing our true potential? We were very China-centric about 15 years back. Today, we have let go of China because we know that we can't compete with it. And that is not the idea. The idea was, even 15 years back, we should have grown at our own capacity. Our GDP growth, our FDI investments, our social inclusion, our democratic fabric, we are very different from China. China has a very different governance mechanism, which is that of the communist regime. We are the largest democracy in the world, and the federal structure of our country is so rich that my state, let's say Odisha, we have the Biju Janata Dal, my party, and my leader, Shri Naveen Patnaik, who works for my state. Similarly, you have the same of YSR in the Andhra Pradesh. You have it that in West Bengal in the TMC. So we have a federal structure. One size fits all will not do. Therefore, there has to be more enabling provisions. There have to be more enabling procedures, policies, legislations that would help energize this entire idea of innovation. And e-governance is one of the areas that we can do. But in top of that, we have to create mechanisms by which this conservative ideas that we hold can become more and more robust, can become more and more aggressive, can become more and more innovative. I have completed my 30 minutes. I will stop now and I'll request Sohini ji that if there are specific questions, I'll take them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Patra. That was such kudos to you for summarizing the past so many years into a 30-minute sort of conversation. But we have a couple of questions, and they actually touch upon a lot of things that you spoke about. The first one that I think it would be really helpful for our audience to know, given that the 26th Climate Summit is going on now, and if we just generally see the role of youth, and of course, keeping in mind India's demography, where do you think the youth fits in governance? In the sense that if people like us want to contribute, apart from joining the government, in the legal field, for instance, or in any other field, how do you participate? How do you see in the future as well the youth being a part of governance?
I believe today the youth in this country have a tremendous potential called as social media. And unfortunately, I mean, with all due regards, and I see my daughter, she's in class 11th, but I sometimes tell her, okay, there's life beyond the Instas and all the postings and the TikToks. There's a life beyond that. And what I'm saying is, look, everybody doesn't have to be a politician, as you rightly said, Sohini. Everybody doesn't have to join politics. But the idea is, wherever you are, you're a lawyer, can you help in terms of providing free legal aid to the under trials? You don't have to do it for 10. Can you take up one case? Somebody who's a professor, if management, let's say the School of Banking, can you think about financial inclusion for the underprivileged of the communities in and around the university in Sonepat? Adopt 2 villages, adopt 1 village, and drive that financial inclusion. Usually we think about the big macros. We say, oh, I'm going to draw change. But for the youth, I have a very small message that Mother Teresa once said. And one person, very interesting, a person went to her and said, Mother, you're treating so many people with leprosy, but still so many people are dying of leprosy. So is your work worth it? She said, my son, I'm not worried about the enormity of the task. I'm entrusted with the task itself. And I believe the youth should focus on being entrusted with the task itself. If you're a student, your small blog post on what you feel, what you like, and shared among 20 people on WhatsApp instead of TikTok videos and WhatsApp Instagrams can also make an impact. I'm not saying do it only, but among the 20, if someone just goes to the WhatsApp feed, and this is something that I tell my kids at times, or their friends, I said, if you look at the Instas or the WhatsApps that you share through a day, and you look at the number of posts that you make on social media, how much of it is really adding value? To add value to society, if the youth thinks about adding value to itself and to people, 5 people around it, it can make a difference. Today, let's say we're talking about environment. We're talking about the COP26. We're talking about climate change. We're talking about green jobs. The question is, what are we doing about it in terms of our own personal reach? If, let's say, somebody is working in an organization, can that person think about an innovation using a quality circle to actually try and imbibe green practices within his specific desk? So usually we think about the big macros, but I would say the youth have a great role, primarily because we are a young country. But mind you, Sohini ji, we will be also an old country because the pyramid will invert. So when the pyramid inverts, if we have not conserved enough energy and we have moved from non-renewable to renewable energy, I think we would have lost the bargain. And that is where the youth have so much of a role. Adoption of green technology. I think that is something that can really change the way things are. If more and more youth buy green vehicles, and honestly, I'm not a stakeholder or an investor in any green vehicle company, but if more and more youth buy green vehicles, there's a demand for more electric charging stations, and therefore you'll have still more people buying it. Today, the bottleneck is not buying green energy. It is about how you'll sustain that green vehicle. I think the youth have a great role in adopting to green technologies by themselves, encouraging it around them, and creating awareness wherever they are. So everybody doesn't have to become a MP, an MLA, a Sarpanch, a general secretary of a party to do that. They can very well do it in their own professions and still make it count.
That was greatly put. Dr. Patra, the next question is kind of related. It has two parts to it. The first is you spoke about e-governance a lot. And of course, now you're speaking about social media. You see technology companies like Twitter starting initiatives like the Twitter Samvad, where the government of India is sort of launching e-governance along with social media. What are your thoughts on that? That's the first part. And the second part is because you spoke about centralization, of power. Throughout telecom and 5G and all of that. In the future, what do you see governments being like? Do you see a more decentralized India, or do you see a more centralized political environment going forward?
To the first part of your question about social media and companies like Twitter, I think we all saw the muck that flew around with Twitter and whatever happened, and our dear colleague in Parliament, Dr. Tharoor, and the committee. So I will not wade into that controversy, but one thing I would like to say is that social media, especially any platform, why only Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, anything that you can say, where the government or like-minded people can transmit positivity or talk about greater awareness, not only in the English language, but also in regional languages, and it reaches the bottom of the pyramid, is always welcome. So I am a great votary because I go to the villages. You may not find that there is a DTH antenna, but you'll surely find that there is a smartphone. Now, the smartphone may have data connectivity or not, but people are happy that they want to stay connected. And I believe India's adoption of technology and there's this sense of low resistance is really important for social media to become a great enabler. And social media, therefore, can not only build awareness, but whatever comes in social media, fortunately or unfortunately, is considered the Bible truth. So that's why the WhatsApp University is derided quite a bit. But even then, if there is a WhatsApp message which is interesting, even you and me will watch it. We may reject it, but we'd love to read that. And that is where you find social media and the Samvad that the government is working on is a positive step. Coming back to the second part of your question, in terms of centralization, I believe any government, whether it's the center or the state, has to decentralize. And that was the essence of the Panchayati Raj mechanism. Why did the Panchayati Raj mechanism come in? It was primarily to ensure that right down at the village level, the Sarpanch level, the Samiti level, the block level, to the Zilla Parishads, to the state legislature, to the parliament, the powers are decentralized. I do see many a times in many of the bills that come in parliament that there is a sense of centralization. And that is where states like us, we also fight with the center. And we say, look, these are the powers of the state that the center cannot take away. So I believe that tug of war is going on. Presently, the numbers are on that side, so somehow it gets through. But I can assure you it's not sustainable. And when it's not sustainable, when it will not be workable, we will again have to revert back to a decentralized system. Because while in India, we are unitary in spirit, as we say, we are federal in structure. And because one size fits all will never work in India, has never done. Politically, socially, economically, we are different. We are one as a nation, but we have different preferences and choices. And therefore, I believe the powers that are there of governance per se will lead to decentralization, and greater decentralization is ensuring empowerment of people. If we do not decentralize, we're not empowering people. So I believe sooner or later, with more and more literacy, more and more awareness, more and more assertion, and more aspirations among people, you will lead to decentralization, even if the powers don't want it.
That's such a relief to hear, Dr. Patra. We rarely hear someone in politics say, talk about decentralization, but that was such a lovely note to end on. We of course have many more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. We had a really nice session. I mean, just to quickly summarize in 30 seconds, I think the key takeaways, at least for me, were you started by talking about how governance is related to politics, policies, and of course the laws and regulations, which is a really important takeaway, and most people kind of don't look at that. And we ended with decentralization and of course spoke about technology.